The forest was never silent. Even in the dead of night, when the moon hung low and the world seemed to hold its breath, the trees whispered. It was a sound that crept into your bones, a low, insistent murmur that could make you question whether it was the wind or something else entirely. For Jessica, it was the reason she had come. Shadow Hollow, a forgotten stretch of woodland nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, had called to her for years. It was a place of legend, of tragedy, and of secrets buried so deep they had begun to rot. Jessica had always been drawn to the unknown. As a journalist, she had made a career out of digging into stories others were too afraid to touch. But this was different. This was personal. The hollow was where her grandmother had disappeared 50 years ago, leaving behind only a cryptic journal and a family shattered by grief. Jessica had read the journal 100 times, each page filled with frantic scribbles about shadows that moved on their own, voices that called from the trees, and a presence that watched from the darkness. Her grandmother had been convinced the hollow was alive, and now, standing at its edge, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her too. The first night was uneventful, save for the whispers. Jessica had set up camp in a small clearing, the trees looming like sentinels around her. She told herself the sounds were just the wind, but as the hours dragged on, the murmurs grew louder, more distinct. By dawn, she was certain she had heard her name. The second day brought the first sign that something was wrong. Jessica had ventured deeper into the forest, following the faint trail her grandmother had described in her journal. The trees grew denser, their gnarled roots twisting like serpents beneath her feet. She found the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was a crumbling structure, its wooden beams sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. They looked ancient, but the edges were sharp, as if they had been made recently. That night, the whispers became voices. They were faint at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, but soon they were impossible to ignore. They spoke in a language Jessica didn't understand, their tones alternating between soothing and menacing. She tried to block them out, to convince herself it was just her imagination, but then she saw it, a shadow, moving on its own, just as her grandmother had described. It darted between the trees, too fast to be human, too deliberate to be an animal. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as it stopped at the edge of the clearing, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. She reached for her camera, but when she looked again, it was gone. The third day was when the forest began to change. The trees seemed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and the whispers became a constant hum, vibrating in Jessica's skull. She found herself losing track of time, her thoughts muddled and disjointed. She stumbled upon a series of shallow graves, their markers nothing more than jagged stones. One of them was fresh, the earth still loose. Jessica's hands trembled as she brushed away the dirt, revealing a familiar locket. Her grandmother's locket. Inside was a photo of a young woman, her face frozen in a scream. That night, the shadows came for her. They emerged from the trees, their forms shifting and merging, their voices a cacophony of whispers and screams. Jessica ran, her heart pounding in her chest, but the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and contorting to block her path. She tripped over a root, falling hard onto the forest floor. When she looked up, she was no longer alone. The figure stood before her, its form flickering like a dying flame. It was humanoid, but its features were indistinct, as if it were made of the same shadows that surrounded it. It reached out a hand, and Jessica felt a cold, numbing fear grip her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned in close, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You should have left the past buried." The next morning, Jessica woke up in her tent, her body aching and her mind foggy. She told herself it had been a nightmare, but the locket was still clutched in her hand. She packed up her camp, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. She needed to get out of the hollow to leave the whispers and the shadows behind. But as she turned to leave, she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was her grandmother, or something that looked like her. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and translucent. She raised a hand, pointing deeper into the forest. "You can't leave," she said, her voice a ghostly echo. "Not until you understand." Jessica's legs moved on their own, carrying her deeper into the hollow. The trees grew thicker, the air heavier. She came upon a clearing she hadn't seen before, its center dominated by a massive, ancient tree. Its roots twisted and coiled like serpents, and its branches reached high into the sky. Their leaves black and withered. At its base was a hole, dark and yawning, like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were inside her head now, a chorus of voices urging her forward. She stepped into the hole, the darkness enveloping her. The air was thick and suffocating, and the ground beneath her feet was soft and yielding. She stumbled forward, her hands brushing against something cold and wet. She pulled out her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The walls of the cavern were covered in the same symbols she had seen in the cabin, but these were older, more intricate. They pulsed with a faint, sickly light, as if alive. In the center of the cavern was a pool of black water, its surface perfectly still. Jessica approached it, her reflection staring back at her. But it wasn't her reflection, it was her grandmother, her face twisted in agony. She reached out, her hand breaking the surface of the water, and Jessica felt a cold, numbing pain shoot through her body. The whispers stopped. The cavern was silent, save for the sound of her own breathing. She looked down at her hands, her skin pale and translucent, just like her grandmother's. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was trapped, just like her grandmother had been. The hollow had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others. As she turned to leave, she saw the shadows again, their forms shifting and writhing. They surrounded her, their voices a low, guttural growl. "Welcome home." Shadow Hollow was never silent. Even in the dead of night, when the moon hung low and the world seemed to hold its breath, the trees whispered. And if you listened closely, you might hear Jessica's voice among them, a faint, desperate plea for someone to find her, but no one ever did.